Russia lost more soldiers this year than it recruited. Zelensky read out the exact numbers himself on camera this week. And the gap between those two numbers is why Moscow is now quietly preparing something much bigger. Today's video is about numbers that Ukraine's own intelligence services put together, and what they actually mean for what happens this autumn. Not speculations, a specific verifiable set of figures released this week, and the mobilization wave they point toward. Welcome back. Let's start with what Zelensky actually said. In his evening address on July 25th, Zelensky laid out figures from Ukrainian intelligence covering the first 7 months of 2026. Russia recruited approximately 221,000 people into its armed forces during that period. In the same window, Russian losses reached nearly 225,500, including around 131,000 killed and almost 93,000 wounded, many of those wounds severe because, as Zelensky put it, frontline medical care in Russia remains catastrophically poor. Read those two numbers side by side and the conclusion is unavoidable. Russia is currently losing soldiers faster than it can replace them, even before you ask whether the replacements are trained to any meaningful standard. Zelensky didn't stop at the numbers. He said Ukrainian intelligence shows Russia preparing the conditions for expanded mobilization later this year, and that Moscow's autumn plans notably don't include peace. Part of that preparation involves bringing in outside manpower. Zelensky said Russia wants an additional 30,000 troops from North Korea, with preparations already underway since June in Voronezh region to receive them, alongside additional launchers for North Korean ballistic missiles. He framed that specifically as a danger that extends beyond Ukraine, a chance for North Korea to gain real combat experience and improve its weapons using a live battlefield, with implications for every country within range of those missiles once that experience gets applied elsewhere. This wouldn't be North Korea's first rotation into this war either. Earlier deployments to Kursk region reportedly suffered thousands of casualties themselves, which makes the willingness to send another 30,000 either a sign of how little Pyongyang values those soldiers' lives, or a sign of how much it values whatever it's getting from Moscow in return. Likely both at once. It's worth pausing on something Ukrainian officials themselves acknowledge here. Reliable, independently verifiable data on Russian recruitment is genuinely hard to come by. Even Ukrainian intelligence reporting from earlier this year, which suggested only around 70,500 new contract soldiers signed up in the first 3 months of 2026, came with the caveat that Russia was already falling short of its own recruitment targets. So these numbers should be read as Ukraine's best current intelligence assessment, not as an independently audited government statistic. Which doesn't make them wrong, but it does mean the specific figures deserve that context rather than being treated as beyond question. That caveat matters more than it might sound like, because a lot of coverage of this war treats any number attached to a government's name as settled fact the moment it's spoken aloud, when the honest answer is closer to, this is the best estimate available from the side that has an obvious interest in the number looking a certain way, checked against whatever independent verification exists, which in this specific case is limited. Now, why does the timing of a new mobilization wave matter specifically? Russia holds a parliamentary election in September, and multiple Russian voices, not just Ukrainian ones, expect any large-scale mobilization to follow shortly after those results are in, rather than before. A visible call-up before an election the Kremlin needs to look calm and controlled for would be politically costly. Waiting until immediately afterward buys time to manage the optics while still hitting the front before winter operations intensify. And it gives state media a clean several-week window to shift the national conversation onto something else entirely before the announcement lands. This is also where a specific Russian military voice becomes relevant, the well-known war blogger and commentator Alexander Sladkov, someone who has spent years supporting the war effort on air, has himself said in what reads as genuine frustration rather than propaganda, that Russia currently lacks the troops and resources to mount the kind of offensive on Odessa that's been promised to the Russian public for years as the move that would restore control over the Black Sea and Crimea. Sladkov specifically ruled out an Odessa offensive even if another 500,000 men get mobilized, describing the front as stuck in genuine positional stalemate. When a committed pro-war voice says the numbers simply don't support the promised outcome, that carries more weight than the same argument coming from Kiev. It's the kind of admission that doesn't happen unless the gap between what's been promised on state television and what's actually achievable on the ground has become too obvious to keep papering over, even for someone whose career depends on maintaining that gap for as long as possible. There's a rough way to actually test that claim with math rather than opinion. Ukraine's unmanned systems commander, Robert Magyar-Brovdy, has tracked this closely enough to give Reuters an estimated average cost of eliminating a single Russian infantryman, roughly $918, or about 2 drones per soldier. Compare that to what large-scale mobilization could plausibly buy in return. At the current rough exchange rate, this war has settled into, call it land for lives, 500,000 additional Russian soldiers, more than 1.5% of the country's remaining working-age population, might net something in the range of 385 square kilometers. That's about 0.06% of Ukraine's territory, roughly the size of Vienna's city limits. It is, by any reasonable standard, an extraordinarily expensive way to acquire a small amount of ground, which is presumably part of why so many Russian military commentators themselves have grown openly skeptical that a fresh mobilization wave accomplishes anything beyond adding to the casualty total. Set against a cost of under $1,000 per soldier eliminated, 500,000 more men isn't a plan for victory so much as a plan for a much larger number appearing in next year's version of this same casualty count. Put another way, it takes roughly 30,000 working-age men to sustain a town of 120,000 people. On the current casualty pace, Russia is effectively spending the working-age population of a mid-sized city every single month to take villages in Donbass. And even that comparison undersells it, since some of those villages, like Malotokmachka, have already changed hands back to Ukraine since being captured. None of this means Russia's army stops functioning or that this war ends on a specific date. Large militaries have absorbed extraordinary losses before and kept fighting, sometimes for years past the point outside observers expected collapse. But the specific numbers released this week aren't vague warnings. They're a direct comparison between recruitment and losses, delivered by name with a time frame attached from a government that has generally been accurate about troop movements it chooses to disclose publicly, even when it hasn't been right about everything else. And there's a September election sitting right in the middle of this timeline, which is worth remembering the next time state media in Moscow describes the situation on the front as fully under control, a claim that gets harder to sustain the closer that vote gets, and considerably harder still the week after it's over, once the political cover for a difficult announcement disappears. Zelensky's numbers describe a country recruiting slower than it's burning through soldiers. Sladkov's own admission describes an army that can't deliver the offensive it's been promising its own public for years. And somewhere in the gap between those two facts, an autumn mobilization wave is already being prepared, not to win the war outright, but simply to keep the arithmetic from getting any worse than it already is, at least until the votes are counted and the announcement can safely be made.